Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to your early morning briefing for Thursday, the 17th of April, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Quick admin note. If you're in the greater Houston area tonight, I will be in Katy, Texas. That is just west of Houston, giving a talk to the Katy chapter of the True Texas Project. It's a essentially conservative political activist group and organizing group. And we're going to be talking about the left and the far left and what they're planning for this year, and also how people can begin preparing for that. I'm talking a lot about organizing at the local level. If you are in the greater Houston area, make plans to attend. I have details over on the Early Warning Network list of events. So just check the events tab and come on out and join us. I know a handful of folks are going to be out there. So we're going to have an Early Warning Network meetup prior to the meeting, and then we'll have the meeting. All right. And let's go ahead and jump into today's In Focus item. There was a mass call last night where left-wing activists, this happens every few weeks or so, and left-wing activists spelled out the next chapter of this indivisible and hands-off protest movement. And they are calling for at least 150 May Day protest and direct action events across the country. This is coming up on Thursday, May 1st, maybe also during the weekend. And they want to see more overt acts of resistance against the Trump administration's deportation efforts. One organizer, specifically the host here, looking like a Batman villain, called on volunteers to go out and physically block deportation flights and take other high-risk actions in civil disobedience. This is significant. This is not the first time that organizers have called for activists to go out and block deportation flights. Previous calls have gone virtually unheeded that I'm aware of. I have not seen a single, there may have been one, but I have not seen any kind of overt organization or movement to go out and block these deportation flights. Why this matters now, what's changed now, is that they have been building momentum on the protest front. Earlier this week, I said they're nearing an inflection point. The left-wing protest movement is nearing an inflection point. And actually, this is one thing they talked about last night as well. And so they're trying to continue building momentum, not just for these national days of protest, but trying to build momentum and push the movement into sustained direct action campaigns. That is the next phase. They've been trying to move from symbolic resistance, so things like protests, into selective resistance. And those are things like direct action. So, protest is, the way they describe this is protests serve a purpose, but I don't think they're politically significant. Protests don't really have a direct impact on governance. Direct action, however, that moves away from protests. That's stuff like civil disobedience. And that tends to be an accelerator because that's going to get more media coverage. And with more media coverage, more people are going to be kind of turned on to the fact that there is a resistance movement building. And it serves as a form of agitation and in many ways propaganda. And those things are typically used to recruit and build a recruiting pool of protesters from which they will draw people who will engage in forms of direct action. Last night, this is almost certainly an attempt to test the waters for, at this point, limited direct action, because organizers at this point, they want to gauge if there's public support for these types of resistance and direct action demonstrations. This is not something where they can just push a lot of people into these forms of direct action, because I don't think they necessarily know that at least 15 to 30% of the public will support this. If there are some examples of limited direct action and there's a groundswell of support and you get this like Mangione effect, then we will see a lot more of it. So I think this is one of the key hurdles here in moving from phase 1 to phase 2 of this broader resistance or popular revolution. It really is a popular revolutionary movement they're trying to build. And so we are kind of at the first hurdle here between phase 1 and phase 2. And this is important because they are trying to move into phase 2 so that selective resistance. And so this is where a resistance or a revolutionary movement engages in overt acts of political defiance. And political defiance is a very important term because you go back and you read Gene Sharp's Color Revolution manual. It's called From Dictatorship to Democracy. And the whole effort is to push a significant portion of the country into mass political defiance. And so the next phase will be sit-ins and occupations, sustained mass public demonstrations, and this is the hurdle they're trying to overcome now. The reason why I think they will probably be successful is because I do think there is a popular opinion. And when I say popular, I don't mean lots of people like it. I popular meaning of the people. I do think a substantial portion of the country now believe that we are in a constitutional crisis or heading to a constitutional crisis. With that, let's bring Robert on. Robert, we have seen a lot of people talk about the United States now being in a constitutional crisis because the Trump administration is publicly defying this 9-0 Supreme Court ruling. And we're not making a case on whether that's right or wrong, or whether deporting this Abrego Garcia guy was legal or illegal. We're just plainly stating facts here. Now, this Judge Boasberg says that there's probable cause to find the federal government, the Trump administration, in contempt of court. Seems like an escalation. What's going on?
Morning, Mike. Correct. This is an escalation. And I think it's important to point out that Boasberg said criminal contempt of court because there is also a civil contempt of court. And I think that's important because that is a major escalation from the district court. And he said this is over what he's called willful disregard, saying the Trump administration willfully disregarded his order to turn those planes around a few months ago that had Trinidad Aragua members headed to El Salvador. And also yesterday, the Trump administration directed the federal immigration courts, which fall under the DOJ, they are not independent Article 3 courts, to look through their entire caseload and find asylum cases that they said could be denied without a full hearing. And so I think these two developments are setting up the Trump administration for a constitutional crisis tipping point. Because if Boasberg does refer some Trump officials to the Department of Justice for criminal charges, I think it's likely Trump could direct Attorney General Pam Bondi to drop those charges and openly defy that order. And I think the same would happen if Boasberg tried to send the U.S. Marshals after Trump officials with an arrest warrant. I think the Trump administration would also likely direct the U.S. Marshals not to enforce that warrant. In this case with the immigration courts, I've already seen a couple of immigration lawyers and legal scholars say that this is flouting due process. And I think that's the messaging that the Trump resistance is going to go with, that this is flouting due process protections for illegal immigrants trying to claim asylum, and this is going to ratchet up that constitutional crisis narrative.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I've also seen that. I've also seen Democrats now, not just it seems like Democrats have been calling for impeachment since day one, but I have noticed an increase in calls for impeachment over this. You know, Robert, if I were advising the Trump administration, I guess I have a problem understanding why this is the hill that certain Trump officials may want, not necessarily die on, but why they're going to bat over this. I mean, if you have the 9-0 Supreme Court ruling, there has been talk about bringing this guy back, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, bringing him back and trying to redeport him again, the quote unquote right way, where they get a judge's order that he is now subject to deportation. It seems like if one judge says he's not deportable, another judge can say he is deportable. Knowing that this is really riling up the left and will almost certainly push the left into from that phase 1 symbolic resistance to phase 2 selective resistance. We're talking about direct action. I just don't understand why the Trump administration is willing to escalate over this matter in particular.
I saw a couple of times that Stephen Miller has come out in the last week to talk about this specific fight and then the more general immigration fight with the courts. And my impression is that the Trump administration, Trump, who is, I think, listening to Stephen Miller very closely on immigration enforcement, they see this as if they give up this fight, then they're losing momentum for their entire agenda. Because this was a major plank in Trump's 2024 campaign was remigration or mass deportations. And I think they're concerned that if they don't fight this, then it's ceding ground in future legal fights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't understand why they can't have some. Well, I guess if they were to bring this guy back and try to re-deport him the quote unquote right way or the legal way, I don't see why. I guess you couldn't just have some other federal court judge issue an injunction against another federal court's judge, injunction on a re-injunction. I don't know. This is getting very complicated. Is this going to the Supreme Court? Robert, where did this wind up?
Yeah, I think this is likely because the Trump administration's already said they're going to appeal this to the district of the federal appeals courts. And it's been kind of hit or miss for the Trump administration at the appeals court. And this could be headed back to the Supreme Court for them to either, clarify what they want the Trump administration to do, or because that 9-0 order, the Trump administration has been arguing that that the courts do not have authority to direct the president in how to engage in foreign policy, and that this is now a foreign policy matter. And considering that 9-0 ruling, I'm not sure where the Supreme Court's going to go either. I would think they would side against the Trump administration and appeal on this.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thanks for that. And let's move on to the rest of today's items, starting inside the Beltway. All right. China's economic containment strategy revealed. What's going on there, Robert?
So according to some people familiar with the discussions inside the White House, the Trump administration is preparing to ask foreign trade partners to levy tariffs on Chinese imports. And the idea is they want to stop China from finding trade avenues around the tariffs that the Trump administration has levied on China. Something else interesting here, actually more interesting than just this, is that the Trump administration also is considering asking these foreign trade partners to impose what they're calling secondary tariffs. And these would be tariffs on goods from countries with close ties to China. So I think this is not just trying to economically contain China, but also more broadly economically contain this anti-West bloc that has grown since 2020. That includes Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then let's jump back on this Kilmar Obrego Garcia thing. So there was a member of the House of Representatives, a Democrat, went down to El Salvador to try to meet with this guy. And apparently the CCOT prison told him no.
Yes, Senator Chris Van Hollen, and he announced this trip yesterday, and we covered it, but he apparently did talk to El Salvador's vice president, and they said they were not going to release Kilmar Obrego Garcia. And he said that the government also denied Van Hollen's request to meet with Garcia. Something else Van Hollen said during this meeting was that he asked El Salvador's government to release Garcia, after they protested returning him to the United States. And he told them just release them and, quote, we'll find a way to get him from El Salvador to Maryland. So I think what's going on with this in this specific case is that these Trump resistance Democrats in the Senate and in the House eventually, I think, are going to make their way down there, are attempting to set up a high profile confrontation with the Trump administration by trying to get Garcia just simply released into El Salvador and then bring them back to the United States themselves. Right now, El Salvador doesn't appear likely to do this, but Van Hollen did say that Senate Democrats are going to try to block funds that the Trump administration is paying to El Salvador to house these deported gang members. I think with the idea of pressuring El Salvador to release them.
Mm-hmm. We previously talked about this inside-outside strategy where Democrats work inside a government I think at this point, the strategy has been pretty clear, which is to cause a national crisis or a constitutional crisis. That's the inside strategy. And then the outside strategy is you capitalize on that by agitating people. You get them angry, you push them out into the street. And now you build this mass protest movement. Earlier this week, I said we are probably nearing an inflection point here. And I don't know, Robert, I wonder, do average Americans care about this? I mean, is this, in other words, can Democrats build a national protest movement around this one guy? Because that's essentially what they're doing. They can't do it around deportation writ large because Americans actually support deportation. Can they do it over Supreme Court? I don't know. I look at this and I say, maybe this actually does not. Maybe this is not the tipping point. Maybe this does escalate from phase 1 to phase 2 type activities. But this is not a mass resistance scenario. I think we still have to wait for something else, some trigger to happen. Robert, are they going to build a national protest movement around this one guy?
Well, I think they're trying. And so the narrative I've seen of all of these Democrats talking about Garcia, and not just lawmakers, but commentators and activists, is that they, in the media, they always call him a Maryland man, I think, with the idea to basically convince people who don't really pay attention to this specific case very closely that the Trump administration has deported a citizen or a legal resident when they haven't. I mean, he had a deportation order that was just temporarily blocked in 2019 because he had claimed that a rival gang would murder him if he went back. And the Trump administration has been arguing that, well, that order no longer applies, one, because he's an MS-13 member, which is a declared foreign terrorist organization, and the gang no longer exists. But I think that's what they're trying to do is convince a lot of Democratic base voters who don't pay super close attention to this case that the Trump administration has escalated by deporting a citizen.
Mm-hmm. Another movement built on a lie. Ben brings up a good point. This guy's an El Salvador national, and so the question is, can the Supreme Court, or can any U.S. court, federal court, order El Salvador to repatriate, or to not repatriate, but order the government of El Salvador to return one of their own nationals back to the United States? And I guess the answer is obviously no. All right, thanks for that, Robert. Let's move on to the rest of today's report, and I'll let you take the roll-ups.
So the California government is suing the Trump administration over tariffs, over President Donald Trump's use of emergency powers to impose these tariffs, specifically the ones against Canada, Mexico, and China. California Governor Gavin Newsom said that he would have to cut $3 billion from California's budget next year due to the impact of tariffs. I'm not sure yet how far this is going to go in the courts, whether California is going to have standing to force the Trump administration to eliminate these tariffs or not. But I think they're going after the emergency powers because that's where the Democratic and even Republicans in the Congress have been targeting and trying to get these tariffs rolled back. And then New Jersey union workers from the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, they voted to reject a new contract with New Jersey Transit over disagreement on pay increases. And their vice president said the union is actually prepared to strike as soon as next month if an agreement's not reached. I've seen a little bit of talk about a May Day 2025 strike. I forget which specific union had talked about it. But looking into the previous fights with this, with the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, and their contract is up about every 3 years, which has set up another fight over their contract ahead of that 2028 May Day general strike that Sean Fain's been trying to push. So I think this is another union that could potentially join that general strike on May Day 2028.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on that topic, I do not see a general strike happening anytime soon. Certainly not in just a couple weeks. Great points, Robert. All right, let's move on. Jared, good morning. The Justice Department is, I guess, embroiled in some law enforcement case against China. What's going on?
Yes. So they just sentenced a private investigator who they say acted as an illegal agent of the People's Republic of China. They sentenced him to 18 months in prison. And they also sentenced his two Chinese clients to 24 and 16 months for attempting to forcibly repatriate members of the Chinese diaspora in order to serve prison sentences in China. Now, this struck me as interesting because the PRC agents would have known who they wanted to be targeted. So it looks to me like they're trying to obscure their presence to either the target or the U.S. authorities and basically further avoid detection, which is a very interesting tactic and could be issues for basically American citizens. Mm-hmm. Moving over to
this is like another case of Chinese policing inside the United States.
Yes, but more obscure than what we previously covered.
Okay. So so not overt Chinese police stations in New York. This is like basically state-sponsored kidnapping. Okay.
Now, President Macron is hosting Secretary of State Marco Rubio, our special envoys Keith Kellogg and Steve Witkoff, along with a German security advisor, to discuss common ground between the U.S. and Europe on a Ukrainian peace deal. There's been a lot of talk about, the broad disparities between what the U.S. is negotiating for, and I've pointed out several times that I think France is taking the lead on this. Here we see them doing it again, but with the Germans here along with them. I expect this to be resolved. That way the Ukraine peace deal can go forward. And lastly, the U.S. approved a sale of up to 600 Stinger man-portable air defense systems, or MANPADS, to Morocco, and that's worth almost $1 billion. It's $825 million. And the sale was reportedly to support the foreign policy and national security objectives of the United States by helping to improve the security of a major non-NATO ally. Mm-hmm. Now, Morocco is interesting because it sits on the Strait of Gibraltar with Spain. I think what's going on here is basically they're trying to prevent a reoccurrence of the choke point we saw in the Red Sea, where shipping was majorly disrupted through basically just targeting ships. And you could do the same thing through the Strait of Gibraltar, but it would also cut off a significant portion of NATO's naval power via France and Italy if they were to shut down the Strait of Gibraltar.
Okay, but MANPADS, these are man-portable air defense, so shoulder-fired air defense rockets. What aircraft are they going to be using those against in the Mediterranean?
So if you look at what kind of drones the Houthis are using, assuming that Iran is funding
potentially
any kind of terrorism in Morocco, they fly low, they fly slow, hit them with a MANPAD.
Okay, interesting. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. Let's go ahead and move on to today's warning items. All right, listen, Tom Homan has said a lot of things. 2 months ago, he said, we're getting ready to ratchet up the, essentially ratchet up mass deportation operations. Oh, the aperture. The aperture for deportation is about to get wider. I'm not sure that it has, but now he's saying ICE is going to flood these sanctuary cities, and this actually has been a point of contention with him going after these mayors and going after the governors. He said, which may be held criminally liable for these illegal sanctuary policies. What's going on, Robert?
So Tom Homan said they're going to flood these sanctuary cities and ramp up work site enforcements. And I think that this could be a deliberate strategy by the Trump administration to go after these sanctuary city, state and local level officials, because the Trump administration has taken other steps to crack down on sanctuary policies. And I think the idea of the strategy would be to try to provoke state and local level Democrats to openly oppose or just try to disrupt these immigration enforcements in order to bring federal, civil and criminal charges against these local and state level officials. I also think that, the Trump administration publicly ramping up enforcement in sanctuary cities and states would likely lead to more of these anti-ICE protests that we've seen a few of so far this year, which could end up with a confrontation between protesters and federal authorities, leading to arrests and I think increasing domestic political tensions.
Mm-hmm. I see that as well. We've previously talked about these left-wing groups doing the de-arrest training. And that's where a de-arrest is where you have these activists or militants, they go out, and as someone is being detained by ICE, you try to physically pull them away from police custody. You, as the name suggests, you literally de-arrest them. And I've not seen, I don't think any de-arrest, at least just from the news that I've seen, I've not seen any of these groups take credit for de-arresting anyone. To my knowledge, it has not happened yet. But this sure seems like a place where, and then also these rapid response networks, the phone and the text trees where people see something and say something. They see an ICE convoy, going to an employment or going into an apartment complex or wherever these people stay, and they'll take a picture, they'll take video, they'll send it back, and then that gets rebroadcast out to everyone in the area, all the activists, so that they can go activate and protest, or maybe try to directly engage these ICE agents. So, Robert, I think you're right on track here. I think that this could enable the rapid response networks and the de-arrest, really direct action, direct forms of engagement on ICE. And this would also be a significant escalation. I guess we're about to see whether the American public, I guess we'll see which side they fall down on this. All right, thanks, Robert. Let's move on to the next item here. Jared, sanctions on what are teapot refineries?
So this is an American State Department term. It's a private Chinese refinery that are the primary purchasers of Iranian oil, and those stand out to me as exceptionally important because in my dive into the Chinese Strategic Petroleum Reserve, uh, there was suggestion that they would use private companies in order to obscure their total amount. So here, I think what's happening is that the State Department is doing a few things. First off, identifying where these are going, where the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is actually being located on the private side. Second, letting China know we know where these are. It's an implicit threat. But also, if you sanction them, it makes it considerably harder to fill that reserve, making a blockade considerably less feasible. This is the fourth teapot refinery that they targeted in the first move. They targeted 3 all at once, and they also sanctioned all of the associated structures for actually getting the Iranian oil there. So shipping companies, the vessels themselves, all of that. At the same time, with the nuclear negotiations looming for Iran, I think what we are seeing is they're trying to get China to press on Iran to get to the table, because all of this is predicated on Iran using this funding in order to destabilize the Middle East. If China presses on them, China can fill their SPR.
Mm-hmm. All right, which would put them in a much better position to weather sanctions and sustained economic, diplomatic pressure over Taiwan. All right, and then finally here, so we have heard about this Chinese charm offensive, China meeting with EU officials, meeting with these countries, meeting with country officials where they're kind of on the outs with the Trump administration over these tariffs. Effectively, China has been trying to win support away from the United States, trying to pull these countries into favorable trade deals with China. Apparently now there's a State Department counter charm offensive.
Yes, President Xi himself is running through most of ASEAN, doing exactly that right now.
Mm-hmm.
And the State Department sent one of its senior officials on a 10-day Asian tour in Vietnam, Cambodia, Japan, all to discuss America's relationships with each one of those. And there are actually specifics he's talking about with each one of them that relate to that specific country. So very targeted messaging there. And then it ends with his trip ends with a visit to the Indo-Pacific Command in Honolulu, Hawaii, to find out the U.S. posture, which I found interesting because you don't normally see an overt coordination between the State Department and Defense Department. Not to say they don't, just they don't normally advertise it. And that's in the announcement, is we are ending this here with coordinating with defense. At the same time, Secretary of State Marco Rubio was in Indonesia yesterday talking to his counterpart, doing the exact same thing. And that was not part of the initial charm offensive announcement. But here he's talking about the free and open Indo-Pacific concept, getting guarantees from them, repatriating illegals, so targeting the domestic policies here, and joint securities with that foreign minister. All of this, I think the fact that they are talking about specifics when President Xi is coming over just saying, oh, I want to resolve our disputes peacefully, when they've been saying that for 50 years and going back on it for 50 years, this does not look good for China, and it looks very good for the United States, because they actually have something that can be made into a plan rather than empty promises.
Mm-hmm. Jared, I agree. This does seem significant. The last time that I can recall the hand-holding between state and Department of Defense was when they went down into Latin America during Trump 45, and then also recently, a little more recently under Biden. And that was an attempt to pull Latin America back from the clutches of Chinese economic investments, the debt diplomacy. So I agree. This does seem very significant here, since they're doing the same thing here with these ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia. All right. And with that, I think we have some time for Q&A.
Yep. Let me pull up the first one here. I just saw it. There we go.
Right? Is it possible all this lawfare is a subversive way to bring El Salvador's president to heel? No, I don't think so. I don't think that's a matter for Congress. I think this has everything to do with bringing President Trump to heel. If China moves on Taiwan, what will North Korea do? You know, Jared, that is something that we did not discuss in our intel huddle on Taiwan the other day. I don't have a great read on North Korea. Any considerations?
I also don't have an exceptional read on them. Part of it is also they're not really going to give much of a warning because they keep all their forces at the border.
So worst case scenario, they invade South Korea, correct?
Yes.
Or like launch a nuke or whatever. Okay.
Yes. And I am hesitant to say that they would because there was a lot of talk about China moving on Taiwan at the same time Russia would, and that did not come to fruition.
Mm-hmm. All right. Next question. Any thoughts on ramifications of Hong Kong Post halting U.S. mail? So I guess this has to do with the de minimis. Are you familiar with this?
No. No. Robert, do you have any?
Robert?
No, I'm not. I don't know anything specifically about the Hong Kong Post situation.
Okay. All right. What's our thoughts on the term economic blockade regarding our situation with China? I guess you're talking about economically blockading of China. So China wants, as near as we can tell, China's most likely course of action is a blockade of Taiwan. I guess the question is, what's our thoughts on a U.S. or coalition economic blockade of China? It seems like if China does move on Taiwan, the second order effect will be to shut down the Malacca Strait, to shut down all these supply lines where China's getting these foreign exports from. Any other thoughts, Jared?
I think that's probably a good term in order to describe it, especially because as we've covered here, it looks like this is all a preventative measure to war and not necessarily a lead up to war.
Mm-hmm. By the way, if you depend on anything from China, obviously you should have been getting it before these tariffs went into effect. We've been talking about this stuff for 2 years now. Bulk up on your necessities that you actually do get from China. But Jared, it seems like this is a lot more realistic scenario this year than it has been in previous years.
Absolutely.
All right, next question. Couldn't the Trump administration disband the federal circuit court since it's not specified in the Constitution? So I see the back and forth here. This is a matter for Congress, Robert, is it not? So people talk about impeaching judges. Speaker Mike Johnson is going to have to bring that. I'm not sure that he has the political capital to do that. I don't see him doing that and then failing to do that.
Yeah, it's one. It would be an exceptional expenditure of political capital to even get it off the ground. But they're not going to get a conviction in the Senate. It requires 2/3 of the Senate to vote to convict a judge on impeachment charges, and that's not going to happen. And as far as disbanding the federal courts, Congress could. It is within the power of Congress to do that. I don't think they're going to do that. The path to doing that would be the House GOP passing a bill to basically reform the district courts, the Article 3 courts, and do what's called the nuclear option in the Senate to get rid of the legislative filibuster. But that would be a major political escalation, and I don't think they would be able to do that without meeting significant resistance both in Congress and outside of Congress.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. All right. Let's move on to the next question here, Jared. All right, do you think there's any validity to the report that Israel called off Iran strikes after Trump intervened? I can't say for sure. It looks pretty realistic to me that Tulsi Gabbard, who has been anti-war, that J.D. Vance, who's also been anti-war, it makes sense to me like that Jared or Robert jump in here. Again, this was reported in like the New York Times or somewhere. It appears real to me that these major figures in the Trump administration essentially vetoed this Israeli strike on Iran, which would have here's the problem. We have heard from Trump, we've heard from Trump officials, we've heard from Elbridge Colby, who's now the Undersecretary for Policy or something at Department of Defense. The Middle East and Europe are not the decisive theaters. The decisive theater for the future of the United States is the Indo-Pacific. Why in the world would we embroil ourselves in a European conflict or a Middle Eastern conflict when we're trying to tackle China? This seems pretty clear-cut and obvious. And I guess this is exactly why the Trump administration ultimately vetoed this Israeli plan to strike Iranian nuclear sites.
Absolutely. That's right where I was going to go. If we ever see any move on Iran at all in this administration, honestly, I expect it to be a lot more like Operation Praying Mantis, where we go in, mess their navy up so they can't touch anything for a while and get back out. And that took, if I remember right, like a week.
Mm-hmm.
It was lightning fast.
Mm-hmm. Now there has been talk about Iran getting closer. I think the International Atomic Energy Association, or whatever they are, IAEA, came out and said Iran is getting closer to building nuclear weapons. Apparently, they've been at the edge within days to weeks for years now. There has been some talk about the United States and Iran continuing to negotiate this. This seems to me like it would be a massive distraction for the Trump administration. I mean, we got a domestic crisis boiling. I think we do not need an Iran war or an Iran crisis. Any other thoughts here?
Yeah, I believe this report as well, just because Steve Witkoff, he's been the lead for the Trump administration on the Israeli-Hamas conflict and Russia now. And what he has done is basically told these European and the people involved in these European and Middle Eastern conflicts, or Israel, Russia, Ukraine, to knock it off because the Trump administration wants to do this pivot. I think famously Steve Witkoff, basically forcing Netanyahu to come in to negotiations on the Sabbath, on the Saturday, religious day, effectively forced him to do that in order to get the original peace deal done. So, yeah, I don't think the Trump administration is looking for, a military conflict with Iran.
Yeah, now is definitely not the time. All right, let's see. Some clarification on the economic blockade. S2 stated that anything over 100% tariffs equates to an economic blockade. Look, no offense to that guy, but that's wrong. An economic blockade would be a physical blockade and not allowing China to import oil. This is a trade war. This is an economic war. As I stated last month, we are looking firmly at economic war has been declared by the United States on China. That much is clear. That is not an economic blockade. Those are tariffs. That's a trade war. So again, no offense to that guy, but he's 100% wrong right here. All right. Any other questions here, Jared? Is there going to be a show tomorrow? I figured taking Easter Monday off, Good Friday. Listen, there's going to be a show tomorrow. There's going to be a show on Monday. So with that, okay, so Ben wants us to address the federal judge overextension question. Robert, this is your domain. I don't know. I think you've talked about before. This is like a multi-month. Maybe these federal judges, if they are reined in by the Supreme Court, not anytime soon. Has your outlook changed?
I think the Supreme Court is trying to, especially Chief Justice John Roberts, is trying to straddle that line between telling the courts to knock it off and telling the Trump administration that they have to follow all orders from the district courts, because it's a catch-22 for the Supreme Court. Because if they side with the Trump, as I said before, if they side with the Trump administration, they're, I think, hurting their legitimacy in the eyes of half of the political body in the United States. And if they side with the district courts, then they are effectively telling Trump that he has to cede Article 2 constitutional powers to the lowest level federal court, which there's over 1,000 in the United States. There are over 1,000 district judges. So basically saying that we don't have, in that case, the Supreme Court would be risking ceding all of those Article 2 authorities to the federal courts and effectively removing any power the president has, at least on paper.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I guess if this does happen, Republican judges will just have to remember that this is now how the game is played if the next time Democrats come into power in the executive. All right, Robert, thanks for that. And good copy there, Bad Web. There's a Substack article. I have not read it, but I just saw the clips. And if this is the right one, some leftist is calling for organized political violence. He's basically talking about murdering Republicans or murdering conservatives. Disappointed, not surprised. We'll have to cover it later. That's going to do it for today's morning briefing. Everyone, thanks so much for watching. If you'd like to get access, come join the community and all the intel posting that happens throughout the day, every day, 24/7. You can do that. Start a free 7-day trial at www.earlywarningnetwork.com and also get access to our special reports up there. We have a whole section of independent intel assessments that we've done. And that's going to do it. Thanks so much again for watching. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on this show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.